If you want to start an argument among goat owners, bring up disbudding. It's an important decision you have to make when you raise goats, and everyone has a strong opinion about it. Today we're going to talk about the pros and cons of disbudding and how to make a decision for your herd. But before we get started on today's topic, I want to read a review from Carrie titled Learning So Much. Starting to dip my toes into homesteading, love the episode on good, better, best. It can be so overwhelming to get started, and Millie really helps break it down on where to start, and it's okay to start small and grow as you go. Thanks, Carrie. If you'd like to leave a review on Apple Podcasts, scroll down to Ratings and Reviews, click on the purple words, Write a Review, then give me stars and tell me what you think. I'd love to hear from you, and you might just hear me share your review on the podcast. Hey friends, welcome to the Get Goatwise podcast. I'm Millie Bradshaw, animal scientist, cattle girl turned goat rancher, co-owner of Dry Creek Livestock, and simple living enthusiast. Here we'll talk about raising goats, chickens, and other homestead livestock, how to create sustainable animal management systems that actually work, and a bit of off-grid life with kids and livestock. If you're ready to take control of your food supply, raise livestock with confidence, and provide your family with the most nourishing meat, eggs, and dairy available, you're in the right place. Kick off your muck boots, pour a cup of coffee, and let's talk livestock. When we first got started in goats, I read and studied a lot, and I was pretty sure that I just didn't want to deal with the problems you can have with horns. I didn't want to put more money into horn-safe fence and always be worrying about where the goats would get their heads stuck next. It seemed so much simpler to just disbud everything and have a hornless herd. Also, we were starting to raise goats for 4-H kids to show, and most shows require wethers to be disbudded, so we were already going to be doing the males anyway. The decision seemed pretty straightforward and clear for our goat raising goals at the time. What are the options as far as horns in your goat herd? Well, you can go horned. Just go natural, leave them as they are. You can disbud your herd, that is, removing the horn buds when the kids are very young. You can do some goats, or all, depending on your management objectives. To disbud the goats, you use a hot iron in the shape of a ring. It's used to burn the base of the horn to prevent future horn growth, and it's usually done between 3 days and 2 weeks old. You can dehorn adult goats. This is not recommended in most cases. It's usually done by a vet, can be expensive, painful, and risky. Banding horns is an option, but results can be variable and marginal. I did band the horns on a young buck that chose to wield his horns as a weapon. It worked, but I wouldn't want to use that as a primary method for dehorning. If your end goal is to have a hornless herd, I wouldn't rely on dehorning adults to get there. There are goats that are naturally polled, which means they don't have horns and they won't grow them. Polled, in this case, is spelled P-O-L-L-E-D. The polled gene is dominant to horned. Very closely connected to the polled gene is the recessive gene for hermaphroditism. While breeding goats to be polled seems like a great idea, if you breed 2 polled goats, they can pass on the polled gene along with its tied-in hermaphrodite gene and affect the kids. Genetic buck kids will appear normal, but their fertility may be affected. Genetically female kids have a high chance of being a sterile hermaphrodite with male characteristics. This isn't always the result, but it's a possibility with polled goats. In horned goats, it's not an issue. When can horns be problematic? Well, goats are notorious for getting their heads stuck in things, especially in the weanling to 2-year-old phase when their horns are short and kind of stick straight up. They tend to get stuck in fences, feeders, and buckets. It's best to buy feeders that are specifically made for goats, with narrower holes so that they can't get their heads through. Fences can be modified using different wire or modifying an existing fence to make it so that they can't get their heads through the holes. You can add a hot wire. We'll talk about that a little later. As far as buckets, you can take the bail or the handle right off the bucket and then they can't get their head stuck. Horns can also cause a problem when they're establishing their pecking order. Now, if they all have horns, it's not a big a deal. It's a big deal when some have horns and some do not. Sometimes when you're handling goats, the horns can be dangerous. Now, why are horns important? First of all, for predator defense. If you don't have a high predator load, this is probably not that big of an issue. I will tell you this, owning goats in town and owning goats out in the country, our goats were much more at risk when we were in town. Typically, town dogs. So I like to make sure that the goats had a defense against the dogs. Horns are also important in temperature regulation, specifically cooling. When you're handling goats, the horns can be dangerous, as I mentioned above, but they can also be very, very helpful. It's easier to control the goats when you can grab them at the base of their horns, rather than grabbing them around the neck, which creates a panic response in the goats and can end up being more dangerous. So here are some other things to consider. It's best not to mix goats that have horns with those that don't, particularly in confinement, and especially if they have to share a common area for feed and water. The horned goats have a distinct advantage, and some will inflict damage while expressing their dominance. So definitely no mixing if you are in tight confinement. If you have plenty of space for the goats to sort out their pecking order while being able to escape each other, they can learn to coexist. I do have a handful of naturally pulled does that run with the rest of the herd, and it works out because they have established their dominance, or lack of, and they have plenty of space to go somewhere else to get feed and water away from the horned goats that may pick on them. If you choose to have a hornless herd in a confined space, you are limited to buying goats that are either hornless, or you need to be willing to dehorn them, so that limits your sources for genetic improvement. What type of goats are you raising? According to the USDA, 64.4% of dairy goat operations disbud, while only 16.5% of meat goat operations disbud. Depending on your goals and what goats may need to be purchased, industry trends are important to consider as far as what may be available for your situation. Disbudding is not fun. In fact, it's my most dreaded task on the ranch. Even though I have quite a bit of practice, there's always a chance of messing up, either burning too much or not enough. Scurs are a pain to deal with and can be really problematic if they curl around and grow back into their head. In my opinion, a bad disbudding job is worse than no disbudding job at all. If you are going to disbud, find someone with a lot of experience to train you. So, what do we do now? Well, the answer is both. But only because we have the available space to do that. If we didn't, I would choose not to disbud. Over 90% of our goat kids keep their horns these days. We disbud the show wethers because it's required for most shows. If we use a dairy buck on our dairy does, their kids will probably be disbudded because all of our current dairy does are hornless. That works well for us, and selling horned dairy does is difficult. The dairy wethers would likely be sold as pets, and most people don't want horns on their pet goats. As I've watched our goats over the last 7 years, I've decided that I like them with horns. I like them to have what God gave them to be able to protect themselves and their offspring. We have predators here, and sometimes the livestock guardian dogs get a little too playful. Horns give the goats a much better defense against all of that. Their horns play a big role in cooling their body temperature, and they make excellent back scratchers, so I feel better leaving them on. As far as handling, the horned goats are so much easier to restrain when it's necessary. It's easier on the goat, and easier on us. Adding a hot wire to existing fences keeps them from sticking their heads through, and it also stops escape attempts, as well as the goats using the fence to rub on, which is very destructive. We haven't had to make nearly the adjustments I thought we would have to as far as fence, and the changes that we have implemented have benefited in many ways beyond just keeping them from getting their heads stuck. I will say that our Spanish bucks with their majestic horns are a bit intimidating, but I'll take that. There's a lot to consider when deciding if you want a horned or hornless goat herd. Goals, fencing and facilities, management, industry trends, ethics, and the actual disbudding itself. Now you know what you need to think about as you decide which direction is best for your herd. Hey there, thanks for listening today. I'm so glad you're here. If this episode helped you or encouraged you in some way, share the link with your homesteading friends. And if you really want to help me out, click on over to Apple Podcasts and leave a rating and a review. You can connect with me on Instagram or email linked in the show notes. And meet me back here soon for more Get Goat Wise.